Hello. All right, this might be the Wimbledon moment. Settle down, please. And lo and behold, this makes no difference to anybody. No, there we are. Okay. It's really a pleasure to welcome all our panelists for our second panel today, Habitats. A disembodied voice, my own, as reverb. Okay, never mind. Pankaj, Heather, Arun, warm welcome to all of you from all the distant parts of the globe that you're in. And Rahul is here with us from Oslo via Uttarakhand. And I'm now going to really turn this over to you, Pankaj, to take it forward. Thank you so much. We've just had an absolutely marvelous session, and we know that the spirit will now continue with all of you. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Good evening, or as the case might be, good morning, particularly for one of our panelists, Heather, who's in a completely different time zone. And I'm assuming I am audible and that we started because, yeah, so I can see Rahul nodding. So I think that means that thing's taken care of. So I'm I'm a little nervous, like you can see, because I'm going to be chairing or moderating a panel that is perhaps will at least be as scintillating as the earlier one that we've attended, and it's been a fascinating 2.5 hours that have just gone by listening to that earlier panel. And so my name is Pankaj Sekhsaria, and I've been asked by the curators to chair this panel. And I must say I come from a point of complete ignorance here. I did not know about the work of the three panelists who will be speaking to us. And on the other hand, I can say that it's going to be a fascinating 2 hours. So I'm contradicting myself because I did a little bit of homework in the morning to see who these people were, what work they did. And to be honest, the best I can do as a chair, taking a cue from the chair of the earlier panel, is to not be in the way of the three speakers that are going to be talking to us today. Having said that, and maybe contradicting myself again a little bit, I will just make one observation before I introduce our three speakers. So the panel that we have today is titled Habitats. And a kind of, if you look at the brochure that's gone around, there's a kind of a subtitle, so to say, of vulnerable landscapes. And it says the panel will reflect on vulnerable landscapes together with the closely interwoven questions of ecology, labor, livelihood, and culture. And I found it very interesting that habitats have been juxtaposed here with vulnerable landscapes and vulnerability. And I think it of course says something in the way that the curators have probably conceptualized this. It may have been deliberate, or to link up vulnerability with habitats, I think, is a very interesting way of looking at it, because vulnerabilities can be about many, many things. So I think that's the context perhaps our speakers will be talking to us about, and we look forward to what they have to say. Each one of them brings a fantastic diversity and experience of work that you get a sense of from looking at their bios and just kind of, even looking at what they have offered, at least on the web for the moment. And before I start introduce, let me also thank Ravi and Ranjit for inviting me for this panel, for this conference, the Goethe Center and MMB. So without further ado, I'm going to give a brief introduction of our three speakers, then hand the forum to them with the request that we keep to about 20-25 minutes. I will have the unpleasant duty, with their permission of the chair, of indicating them, perhaps pushing them to close their remarks, so that we have some time for a discussion, because I think that will be very fantastic and fascinating. And I'm hoping that we will stimulate some interesting discussion. So in our panel today, the first person to speak will be Rahul Ranjan. Dr. Ranjan is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Oslo Metropolitan University in Norway. He's part of the Riverine Rights Project funded by the Research Council of Norway. He has recently published an edited volume, At the Crossroads of Rights, Forest Struggles and Human Rights in Post-Colonial India, published by Routledge Press in March. Oh, it's coming in March. He was awarded a PhD by the University of London in 2020, where he worked for the Human Rights Research Network. And if I understand right, he's at the moment in India doing some field work, and perhaps he can tell us a little about that as well. Our second speaker will be Arunkumar. Arunkumar HG is an artist, he sustained artistic investigation into a diversity of ecological concerns, brings forth disharmonies which are created by rampant consumerist culture. The spread is in inverse proportion to the great decline of natural resources and habitats. With each work, Arunkumar brings in his own local, historical, and cultural milieu. The work becomes generative rather than a conclusive commentary of his concerns regarding the environment at large. His choice of medium, which is reused, recycled goods, and I saw some very fascinating art exhibits today, early in the day, and consequently, the execution of such concerns reflects a negotiation between suburban life and a longing to return to his rural roots. So he is originally from rural Karnataka, but at the heart of urban India today, holding the banner in Gurgaon. The farmer takes on the role of the protagonist and also becomes the subject to assert the integral role she or he plays in the preservation of environmental biodiversity. Arunkumar's solo exhibitions, there's a whole list of them. Construction at the gallery space in New Delhi, I just mentioned a few. Feed Nature Mart in New Delhi, and Sakshi Gallery that was held long ago in Mumbai in 2006. He has also participated in numerous group exhibitions in India and abroad, and in number of artist residencies. He's also, importantly, the creator of a Center for Knowledge and Environment in the Western Ghats region of Karnataka, where he comes from. And finally, to Heather. Heather Davis is a writer, researcher, and teacher whose work draws on feminist and queer theory to examine ecology, materiality, and the contemporary art in the context of settler colonialism. She's an assistant professor of culture and media at the New School. Her book, Plastic Matter, by Duke in this year, argues that plastic has transformed ecologies around the world due to its incredible longevity and range, as it has also transformed our understandings and expectations of matter and materiality. She's a member of the Synthetic Collective, an interdisciplinary team of scientists, humanities, scholars, and artists who investigate and make visible plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. She has written extensively, widely for art and academic publications on the questions of contemporary art, politics, and ecology, and has lectured at a number of places. She's the co-editor of Art in the Anthropocene Encounters Among Aesthetics, Politics, Environments, and Epistemologies, and editor of Desire Change, Contemporary Feminist Art in Canada. So as you will see, it's a very wide range of experience and expertise that our panelists bring to us today. And let me go straight to Rahul. And Rahul, the stage is yours, the forum is yours, and please, you can start. And with your permission, I will indicate to you all at 20. It's my little professor's thing that comes into play often. We have to stop our students who go on and on. So I hope that'll be okay. Like I said, we'll have time then for a discussion. So yes, Rahul, please.
Thank you so much, Pankaj. I wish you were here, but really a great pleasure to have you in the panel. So my paper is part of a longer research that's undergoing in Uttarakhand in particular. And I'm interested in looking at historical register of inequality that is also part of caste order in India. And how does that feature in an emergent crisis of climate change? Through this, I want to make a second exploration in my paper, which looks at the mobilization of an idea called ecological grief. So how we can use grief, loss, pain, instead of simplified versions of statistics and data to explain what it means to be in an epoch of Anthropocene. And I want to argue all through my paper that for me and the purpose of paper, grief is a structuring affect which is not merely an emotion, that evaporate in forms of anger and loss, but it stays. And I want to start this paper by using an epigraph from a person who recently lost his brother. This paper situates a case study of an incident that happened last year in Chamoli in Uttarakhand, where a hanging glacier fell onto the surface, creating a tsunami in the stream of a river called Rishi Ganga, which then hit two subsequent hydropower projects in development, which had over 220 people working on site. Over 200 people are reportedly dead, 157 is not yet found. So this paper uses the case study to illustrate how the reporting on incident related to climate change often becomes causal effect in nature, and it completely overlooks a huge sway of pain that governs the life of those who survive the loss. So in changing climate world, where monumental shifts, and I'm going to read excerpts to remain structured, where monumental shifts are creating new strata by making a diversity of changes, a place for grief often becomes an appendix. At best, grief feature through illustrations and narrative to yet support claims foregrounded in solution-driven and scientific inquiry into climate change. These studies are crafted to serve specific dimension of the problem that is often useful in explaining the causal effect of the incident. In other words, they demonstrate how we mitigate, adapt the effects of climate change. On the other spectrum is the popular representation of climate change through the so-called eventful incident, for instance, in Chamoli, which is portrayed with a ghastly display of collapse and often read through their ruins. When combined, both of these, they create a spectrum that represent Himalaya in general as a riskscape, an idea that Manjari Mehta had written at length about, which basically manufactures truth about lives of those who live in the hills and those in the plains within the same geography. It suspends the possibility of imagining the landscape that is fraught otherwise. Now, these characterizations raise significant concern regarding vulnerability and promises of new models of mitigation. However, it also elicits a specific dimension of approaching the natural environment through technical explanation or recounting disasters as events. It excludes a huge sway of narrative of loss that fills the ordinary life on an everyday basis. Emotions, not data, should be at the heart of change, at the heart of climate change, I claim. This proposition extends, if not moves away from a powerful evocation recently noted by Aruna Chandrasekhar in an editorial piece published at The Guardian, where she claimed, and I quote, "People, not carbon emission, should be at the heart of West's climate action," unquote. This provocation interlaces core concerns of humanity with the scientific research for climate changes. It accounts, as she claimed, for an ongoing struggle led by who sits at the bottom of systemic oppression. Data excludes fact. Emotion resists such reduction. Emotions are drawn from the reserve of experiences that allows our capacity to communicate the loss of both humans and non-human. In the emergent condition of where Anthropocene, a geological epoch, where humans are at the heart of changing the entire ecosystem, the data and humans serve merely as a background to the story of loss that governs the risky Himalayas now. So I argue that in crafting a narrative on disaster, one should account for, if not at least document, forms of loss that are variedly distributed to the entire environment, creating an ecology of grief. In that construction, every bit of such narrative is fraught with slippages, sometimes into the sway of emotional barrier and the absences of voice at other. Most reports that are presented in public in incidents such as Chamoli, in this process at best do not account for entanglements of human, spiritual, non-human dimension, hence are written as passive sites of observation. To foreground this claim, I extend the work of mourning in approaching climate change-led events to understand what is called ecological grief. This work, therefore, is far from proposing a solution and remains exploratory in nature, which exploits interdisciplinary approach and sources to approach the problem. Now, to set the context, The portrayal of Himalayas is often marked by magnificent tales of surprises or territory of fear, risk, and fragility. Some of it is also marked by theory of Himalayan environmental degradation, a theory that makes a claim of an inevitable environmental collapse. These portrayals bear enormously on scientific knowledge, which is often removed from the experiences of the people from within the region. However, it is often seen that these scientific inquiries reinforces certain kind of imagination, if not the ideas of vulnerability, onto the people's life, negating and transforming their own practices and situated forms of knowledge. But Himalayas is fraught. It invites emulsions of varied ideas. Referred variously as third pole, water tank, Himalayas offer a glance into a complex interplay of knowledge, cosmology, and enmeshing of both human and non-human worlds. Himalayas, in fact, is about narratives folded in terrifying beauty, vertiginous terrain, and extreme of weather that both inspire awe and fear. However, the aggressive development, in all honesty, and the thirst for Indian modernity, driven by the need for electricity, fossil fuel, and now securing frontiers, are leaving huge footprints of collapse, one that is gradual form of slow violence, an idea that Rob Nixon has proposed. Increased anthropogenic activity, which includes the construction of dam, mushrooming across the fragile landscape, are emerging as sites of environmental grief. These sites highlight how ruins that are caused by the collapse of infrastructural projects such as dams, often revealing the buried bodies of laborers and loss of ecology. Now, these losses are triggered by a great swell in the construction of dams, alongside the shift in the climate within the region. While both may not be interrelated, each contributed to the common goal of difficulty that makes life challenging in the Himalayas. So I'll quote one epigraph from an interview that I recently took of a person who survived the death of his brother, who died last year in the Chamoli incident. And he said, and I quote, and I will translate loosely in English later, that भाई के मर जाने के बाद हमारे पास कुछ भी नहीं है, वो तो बहुत दूर काम कर रहा था, compensation छोड़िए, हम दुख से मर रहे हैं. Loosely translated as, I've lost my brother and we survived with a number of people. He worked in faraway land. Now, the grief is insurmountable. While the climate change contributes to a variety of incidents that are manifested through landslide, amongst other, the question of entanglement in Himalayas remain completely sidelined. Recent scholarship by Ritodi, Denzing, Mabel have located how indigenous knowledge or situated forms of knowledge that could be used in order to enrich the content of discussion on climate change often face walls when it comes to discussion on climate change that are based on global models adapted in places so differently in terms of geography and culture. Himalayas is vast and offers remarkably different physical landscape. A newly formed state, Uttarakhand, where it's situated, has historically witnessed several disasters, claiming thousands of lives and the collapse of the landscape. Now, in this, and I'm going to quickly read two sections, to give the detail of the incident. On 7th February 2021, resident of Raini village, which is also known for Chipko movement, origins of Chipko movement, in Uttarakhand, woke up to the deafening noise of a collapse that reinvigorated memories of trauma from the past climatic event in the Himalayan region. As you speak to people from around Uttarakhand, you would know that there are vivid memories of disaster that sparsely populate the people in different parts of the hills within the state. So to claim there is one form of trauma and memory is also a simplification of an order. So the noise of this falling was fraught with sound of pouring water, fizzling vapors, boulders, and a roar that soaked the resident in fear. Soon after, videos reporting began to flood the social media, displaying extreme swelling of Rishiganga River, a tributary to the River Ganga as it gushed through the steep and high valley of Raini village to the downstream. The initial geophysical reportage of the event seemed split between forms of climatic events such as avalanche and cloudburst. Subsequently, it was ascertained that a combination of factors has led to the event, resulting from breaking of a hanging glacier in the north of Ronti Peak, a steep Himalayan range located at the elevation of 5,500 meters from above the sea level, that generated an avalanche up in the Himalayas. Soon after, the impact of this rock and ice was felt on the floor of Ronti Gad, which means the rivulet, pushing debris down the river. Subsequently, inquiries into the incident emerged in academic and popular literature. Several people claimed several kinds of scientific knowledge, including vast amount of glacier, sediment, rocks, and dust that descended quickly, creating a roaring noise and vapors emerging from the fall, leading to landslide and death of these many people at the site. So the water flowing downstream with an immense intensity has a confluence point with another tributary to Ganga, which is the Dholi Ganga river, and they both meet together before they go on to meet Ganga later. Both these rivers had ongoing development of two hydropower projects. One was called Rishi Ganga, other was called Tapovan project. Several people, mostly laborers consisting of native and those who come to work in these areas from their remote village, became victim to these incidents. And one of the people who died in the incident was a person whose epigraph I had quoted before I had started the paper. So the incident reportedly claimed 200 lives and several remains missing. Now the reporting of missing person is interesting to note here because missing people are a storied life of people who leave their home in search of employment, bearing witness to inequalities that shape their life. Missing people are stripped away of any dignity, of dignified humanity, and emerge often as deviants to death that are reported. Their absence is always enforced. A month later, a most comprehensive account of the event was produced through a massive collaboration between academics, journalists, and civil society members. The article is now published in Science Journal, consisting of over 50 authors who foregrounded detailed evidence to show how intersection of hazard cascade with down valley infrastructure resulted in a disaster. So this means that there is a cascading effect of a glacial collapse, avalanche, and cloudburst more generally in higher altitude, but it becomes more fatal in circumstances when disaster is ill-prepared, the spurt of tourism, and undoubtedly the mushrooming infrastructural projects such as dam are planted in areas which are fragile in nature. Now what is grief about this incident? So contrary to the portrayal of grief and pain, the reporting and more broadly the discussion on climate change in Himalayas is often fixated on causal effect explanation of the disaster. For instance, the story of Chamoli concealed the detailed life of people, of those who are buried, thawed by cascading boulders, and trapped even after a year in deep tunnels of hydro projects. Their bodies emerge only as count to the numbers of reportedly dead. Not only they are reduced to bodies that do not find their memorial worth remembering, but they're also inflicted with disavowal of stories, folded in painful removal from their far-flung homes. Stories of these people, laborers, 200 of them, who were declared dead were primarily from outside the state, are erased if not forcefully forgotten. Now this erasure, the process when his brother was telling me that wo kahin jaake, kahin dur pe kaam karta tha, that my brother was removed from the context where we live, and I know that he was working somewhere up in that place to which he had no idea. The erasure in this case is of twofold. On one level, the erasure is folded in inequality that shapes the lives of those who work in these fragile ecologies and are often declared collateral in the disaster. The second is erasure that emerged from denial of recognizing the grief that foreshadows the life of those who lost their loved ones. The reportage on disaster, as Kamraz recently has written, and I quote, masks the casual chain of issues underpinning the devastating impact of disaster and privileges only the tipping point of visibility, unquote. So any response to disaster is either imagined in compensatory framework, which is often monetary in nature, or through an assessment of the incident to develop a new guideline. Resilience to recover from disaster is always presumed. absolving authority from any responsibility towards existing social life of human relationship that is conditioned by historical, political, and economic processes. But none insist on probing the gulf of grief of both humans and non-humans. Grief stays. It stays sometimes as languishing as an index in the silhouette of the broken pieces of infrastructure, displaying not only the failure of humanity at once, at others as silences, lapses, and memory. People do not always have language for it, but grief stays. How do we imagine a place about intensifying climate wreaking havoc, hydro projects ravaging humans and non-human under the boulder, making them archive of loss and varied forms of entanglement in the wake of Anthropocene that now emerges on the surface of our writing? So ordinarily, grief is constructed as an, understood as an affective response of human in processing a loss. Grief is not a description, it's neither a language. It is what it feels. It sits in the corner, sideways or at the margin. It occupies a part of our life as rooms we use but are built to stay, sometimes when suspended to the loss and of those who we've lost as memories. Grief is a world of feeling. It can occur from various emotional triggers. In some context, it takes the form of nostalgia, making grief an instrumental tool in searching for return to home. Then nostalgia in turn transforms grief into pathological lack thereof home. Recently, environmentalists have discovered a term called solastalgia, which emerges as an attempt at combining nostalgia, a form of homesickness, with the loss suffered due to the changes in environmental landscape. Studies have shown that solastalgia, when applied to analysis of circumstances where people have been hit by natural disaster, enable us to trace the losses and fear that challenges people's established sense of place and identity. But grief is not nostalgia. It is far more fluid and dissipates into an array of personalized accounts of suffering. Kessler, recently in his writing, has said, grief, and I quote, is each person's unique fingerprint. But what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a sense, a need for their grief to be witnessed, unquote. So grief manifests in the slower dimension of human emotion and often escape conceptual world of meaning making. Needless to say, grief is often ascribed to an emotive category of experiences, removing any political potential. But witnessing this grief is important for it to become political, creating a value that capacitates human to function. In other words, the turn to political in grief emerges from two main points, witnessing and grievability. And there's a number of people who've written on this, but I don't want to take up on that. So how do we think of ecological grief, one that transgresses the foreclosure of our imagination? Ashley Consolo, who worked with idea of grief loss among indigenous people in Canada in her recent work, has argued by extending the work of mourning to non-human, where she says, and I quote, mourning to non-humans through recognition of shared vulnerability and examines the ways in which constituting non-humans as mournable expands the climate change discourse, research and ethics and politics, unquote. And often recognition of grief experienced by human as well as non-human, triggered by climate-induced factors, are silenced in public discussions on climate change, a point that I would like to register here. So the work of the mourning of loss makes grief render visible. In other words, the absence enable the grief to surface and take a terrestrial form. In case of what had happened in Chamoli, is not merely the count to the death. It is the number of people who were died but were registered as reportedly dead. The problem is not external. It is the externalizing factor of emotions from the reporting that is done now regularly in incidences that are related to climate change. And often climate change, as Camellia Divan has recently said, work as a language of masala, which becomes a spice to the description of something that we do not want to be held accountable to. And often in case of Himalayas where anthropogenic activities are aggressive, seeking some sort of validation in the making of nation, grief will find no language, no place. And I want to sort of end this paper, and I'm open to question, by quoting Cade, who'd written about unsettling account of disappearing ecologies under the sea, where she construed grief, and I quote, as in navigating absences, the common experience of loss that came with funerals and memorials. But grief, the undermining upwelling of loss, in response to ecosystem devastation, the failure of conservation remain harder to understand. While written as a provocative climate fiction that outlines the resurrection of grief, Cade posits an interesting departure to understand the role and complexity of anthropogenic footprint wreaking havoc on environment. Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm open to questions.
I'm sure there will be lots of questions and responses, so we can take all of them at the end. And everybody who's joined us, please do send in your questions, and somebody, the organizing team, will put it out for us in the panel, and we'll be very happy to discuss that with you. Thank you, Rahul, for a very evocative rendition there, if I might put it that way. And with that, I'd request Arun now to come on with us. He's based in Gurgaon, so he'll be coming on Zoom and online. So Arun, it's all yours now.
Yeah. Thank you, Pankaj, and I thank Goethe-Institut, Ranjit, Ravi for this wonderful, enriching symposium. So I would begin, since I come from an art background, I have more visuals to share and, and reveal what I do, out of my studio and also outside my studio space. This work, I hope my screen is shared. Pankaj?
I can see it, yes. Maybe somebody in the library can confirm whether they are also able to see it. Yeah.
So this work is called Bhojanalaya, and this is done in 2010. It is part of the show called Tract. So I'm showing this particular work, in connection, what I had been doing, and also my background coming from a farming background, and also kind of search in agrarian, challenges. So after the show in 2010, I felt the need to move out of my studio and then spend more time with my family and family farm and the Western Ghats. That's where I come from. So that, you see that red dot, that's where my, location is. And that's in the middle of the Western Ghats, basically. So just to give more background to what I do and what I, had been thinking about. What you see there is all the hydroelectrical power project that was commissioned in the 1948. And that's how over 350 square kilometer of dense forest and land that was submerged. And with that submerged, you can imagine what all that is drowned there. But people moved out and displaced. So my family happens to, come from one of those drowned place. My father remembers how they moved. This is, the kind of broad background with my, search for my roots in some way, because when the land, the forest and biodiversity, everything drowned, and the cultural roots and, everything drowned, only people moved out. As I just said, about 350 square kilometer of water is the land area is submerged. So equal amount of forest is was cleared for resettlement. So this is how the forest has been had to get cleared and then make a room for their agricultural practice. That's what the basic profession there. So that you can just see there. And in the screen here, you can see that the submersions. This is more clarity here. When I was growing up, when I came to know about all this, and I was trying to look for my roots and all, this is what I learned, and I couldn't really go beyond a point to look for my cultural roots. The people in the area now, they're all displaced, and sort of they were busy in the couple of generations, at least 2-3 generations, they were busy in rebuilding their life again. After I decided to move most of my time to my hometown, and I kept in touch with people. I kept moving, meeting people, many local activists, theater activists, and environmentalists, and so many people. We kept meeting, and then we wanted to have a kind of platform. So that's where the idea of SARA came in. The Sustainable Alternatives for Rural Accord is just a name. The idea was basically to have collaborations and partnerships, and so to expand our the idea of dialogues. So this slowly built this a small place, where people could come and meet and have dialogues and exchange their ideas. And also the main idea of this space, physical space, is to have art as an engaging medium. So you can see all that. Many tribal and folk artists were invited to have a dialogue with locals and all sort of things. When I moved to my family farm on the left side, that's how it was. That's how it is. Most of the areas, for various reasons, the forest is being deforested, and the soil degeneration and all that. So on the right, I started with this regenerating for forest and local flora and fauna, and that's how is at the moment. And also place the idea of this art and things. And also we are going out of the idea of center. We're getting into the community at school levels. We go and show. We have talks and show films and documentaries, and also raise awareness about biodiversity and things. So this is all over the time. And I'm just showing a few major activities, kind of experiments, I must say. In 2017, we thought, to go into the community in a larger way. So we planned for something like 156 kilometers, 6-day walk with that we did in 2018 also. So this was our first ambitious program. So we, how do we go? And we did 6 months of groundwork, visiting the schools and village committees, and talking to them that we are planning this. And so ultimately, we managed to take out the walk. So as a main attraction for this awareness campaign, so we asked our artist friends to sort of give their idea of environment and ecology. So we had requested some more than 200 artists. About 250 artists gave about almost 250 artworks. So that was part of this walk. So as I just mentioned, there were something like we met something like 25,000 students along the way, including villagers. And so in this walk, there were many young artists from many art schools. They just joined us to be part of this walk. And they did many graffitis. And so it was really wonderful experiment, I must say, to get into the community and gauge where they are, and also to sort of get reactions, all that. So, but it was all quite positive, and we learned a lot from there. And in 2018 walk, this whole 4 days walk was led by the students. I mean, the younger generation. We made them to lead the walk, the programs, talking to their counterparts, and all that. It was really interesting engagement. So these were all on the way quick exhibitions and winding up and all that. So with this major 2 years of community outreach, we thought we should get more into the local communities, and not like a flowing a temporary engagement. We wanted to have a kind of very long-lasting engagement. So that's where the Sograma project, that was another ambitious community development program that we thought. And to be with them, it was not easy to engage the villages, because they were always, though I am partly insider, but still I was seen as an outsider. So our friends, local, the environmentalists and theater activist friends, they made it possible to break into their and so we started having a lot of dialogues initially with their local art form, and many hundreds of meetings in we initially chose about 4 villages, but we found a good result in only 1 village. So you can imagine the kind of resistance, or I don't know, but somehow it was, we were successful in 1 village, and you will see more results. This is our Sograma project basic idea. So it was not just just being artists. We couldn't have just insisted or talk about art, but we wanted to have overall we had to touch upon overall developmental needs and the ideas for So we also used to engage local college students for this Sograma work, like surveying each households, what they have, what they don't have, and what we had a very different kind of questions, and we had to gather some information, and also, so that, we have some good information and data in hand to have dialogue with them. Basically, it was an exchange of thoughts, learning from them, and also sharing our ideas. So our first, major project of the Swagrama was to talk about our basic, the needs. So they were, the Western Ghats ecology is very different than others, because it has got slopes, and underneath there is a huge granite and very little topsoil. There is no underground water system. So the water system is basically a spongy forest and small lakes to hold that water and release it slowly in the summer months. So over the years, with borewell technology and all, the lakes were forgotten, and they were all filled with still silt, and so we somehow managed to motivate the villagers to desilt them and start with this water security, the forgotten water security after the borewell technology. So this is how they were engaged, but they got convinced, and with these, you can see how the earlier lakes were with the silt, and how it was remade, rejuvenated. Water being a very culturally rooted thing. So we wanted that to come into their lives. So the earlier the silted lakes used to last only like up to January or so, and then the rest of the summer months used to be dry, and it was affecting the entire ecology, like birds, animals, and also their cultural significance with water, and that was also slowly lost. So this was something, this whole exercise was kind of confidence building with the villagers, the Swagrama members, I must say. And again, now the economic activities like fisheries and that, and this is started again. So they started having that life with water, and also with this, we couldn't have just gone and to the villages and tell them that you do that and do this, and so it was just basically being with them and understanding their difficulties, challenges, and needs, and finally, also they know much more than us. They know, but the challenges are so tough that they can't simply keep up with. So they know the importance of the forest. They know the importance of everything. They are the most the intelligent people who are being close to the nature and close to the soil, and they know much more than anybody. It was just that the conditions and the challenges that kept them vulnerable. So but over the time, now you can see them getting back to planting their indigenous plants and taking care of them. at a community level. It is really something made us confident in whatever we are doing. And what I've just shown you is just part of it. So with all this confidence measure with these local people, so now the things would be easier for us to have more, closer dialogues with them. Earlier it was very, very difficult. Now they are coming to the center and being part of activities. And so, without this, I don't think the idea of center would have worked. So far, this is, one step. The other step is to activate the center, to store or document local knowledge and inviting students every day and have a kind of exchange. So that is what is the whole idea. But we are going step by step. This is one step that we are closer. So this is what basically as an artist, that is my response to the anxieties of the community and anxieties of our what we are losing and the kind of challenges that we are getting to see. The another thing that I wanted to say in the beginning itself, that the Western Ghats in the picture, and when you travel, maybe you will see there's nothing much lost or something, but it is not like that, like how we see visuals of glacier, melting glaciers, in that we can see. But here the loss of biodiversity and the livelihood, because of various developmental projects, like unnecessary widening roads and railway projects and too many things. And people are tired of fighting with the authorities. They're not balanced. They are not keeping the local ecology in the mind. So this is basically our work. This is not just my work. It is a participatory, collaborative work. But I'm just there as a kind of person. Yeah, that's what my part, Pankaj. Can I have questions later? I want to.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you very much. Quite an amazing story, an amazing journey, and I have some questions for you. Am I audible? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So I've noted some questions for you, but maybe we'll come back once we've also heard Hita, and I'm sure questions will come in. We haven't yet received any questions from our participants, but hopefully they will. Thank you so much, Arun. And now, Hita, please, it's all yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to echo everyone's thanks for being here and for the invitation. It's really such a pleasure to learn from you all. I feel very humbled and maybe difficult to follow up on these amazing presentations. But yeah, so I'm coming from a different context, obviously. I'm originally Canadian and now I'm based in New York. So coming to you from Lenape, unceded Lenape and Canarsie lands, who are the indigenous peoples from here. And I like to acknowledge that as a way to be able to commit myself to thinking through the kind of complexities of living on these lands as an uninvited guest. So today I thought I would maybe share a bit of sort of two different kinds of vulnerable landscapes that I've been working with, and through, you'll see that they're very different. So the first one here, I'll tell a little story about it. So in 2013, at the suggestion of oceanographer and activist Charles Moore, geologist Patricia Corcoran and artist Kelly Jasvac traveled to Camilo Beach in Hawaii. The three went in search of a geological formation, a conglomerate of plastic and sand that Moore, as well as many local residents, had been spotting for years. When Corcoran and Jasvac arrived, they easily found the rock-like substance multiplying on the beach. They decided to call it a plastaglomerate, which is what you're looking at on your screen now. So, and the Geological Society of America approved the name with the publication of their eponymous journal article to describe a hybrid material resulting from the fusion of plastic debris with natural materials such as lava, wood, metal, sand, and marine corals. So there are two different types of plastiglomerates. One is a hard multi-composite material consisting of rock, other debris, and molten plastic, like this example that you see on your screen. And the other is an in situ type where the plastic has adhered to rock outcrops and blending with the landscape. So, you know, if you can imagine a kind of a rocky beach where this plastiglomerate is really adhered to what's around it. So Camilo Beach in Hawaii is a good breeding ground for these plastic matrices because it has always acted as a sieve for the currents of the ocean, which deposit many of the things that are adrift in the Pacific, from wood to shells to bodies of people drowned at sea. But these days, what is adrift in oceans is a lot of plastic. As art historian, as I'm sure everyone is aware. So as art historian Kirsty Robertson writes, so much garbage collects on Camilo Beach that it is listed in Atlas Obscura's compendium of bizarre and obscure places to visit, where it is described as constantly covered in trash, like some sort of tropical New York City gutter. And actually, I have to say, as somebody who is, works closely with the people that I'm referencing in this talk, and listening to them about what it's like to go to Camilo Beach, I actually have to say that the gutters of New York City are maybe cleaner than this beach. So the sand has surprisingly little mineral material in it. It is now evidence of the archives and the experiments in chemical engineering that we have been conducting for a little over a century, when the laboratory has been turned inside out so that the world has become the experiment. So when people go down to the water's edge to have a campfire, instead of merely enjoying the primordial glow or singing songs and spending time with friends, they're inadvertently participating in the creation of these new hybrid geologies as the plastic on Camilo Beach melts and adheres to other debris. And this is, I think, one of the interesting moments of sort of thinking about art and science collaboration. So when Jasvac and Corcoran first went to Camilo Beach, the hypothesis was that maybe these plastiglomerates were being formed through volcanic activity, through lava flows, etc. And that's where the heat was coming from to melt the plastic that then becomes these rocks. But they discovered that this wasn't true, that it was happening through beach fires, essentially. And at first, Corcoran, who is the scientist, thought that this was, in a way, some kind of a disappointment because it wasn't speaking to the kind of natural relationships, so-called natural relationships of plastic in the environment. But Jasvac really quickly kind of pointed out that actually, in some ways, this is more interesting, and in some ways more, it tells a very complicated story about the relationship between how we can think about these spaces that we go to for kind of natural solitude or a kind of space of revival, and the ways in which those spaces are so thoroughly saturated with an example of something like plastic. So as much as we might like to think of something like plastiglomerate as one thing, plastic adhering or sticking to other things like sand and rocks. And I think there's lots of ways in which we talk about, rightly so in some ways, about the kind of difference between natural materials and synthetic materials. I think it's also important, and I think that division is important because I think that can also speak to the ways in which certain types of materials are cutting off the kinds of biodiversity or creating massive forms of grief, as the other speakers were talking about, as well as also spreading toxicity in various forms throughout landscapes. But I think it's important to remember that unlike actually thinking about these materials as inherently separate, they're not two substances glued together, but multiple substances that are one another, as Kirsty Robertson would remind us. So the conglomeration of plastic and other beach debris reveals an important lesson about the nature of plastic itself. It cannot be separated out, cleaved from other forms of materiality, and nor does it easily reside only within the category of the synthetic, despite our desires for it to do so. And when I say this, I mean this both kind of like literally in the sense that, one of the problems with plastic pollution, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is the fact that it's very difficult to clean up because it readily breaks down, it readily gets smaller and smaller. And because of that, it's very difficult to then extract it. And of course, then it begs the question of, after you extract it, where does it go, right? There's processes of thinking through ways in which it could be recomposed back into different types of fuels, which people are experimenting with, or there's new forms of bacteria and mycelium that can successfully break down plastics, but these are fairly nascent in terms of their relationships to plastic. Most often plastic either goes to landfill or to recycling, but recycling is a very poor solution for plastics, as you can often only recycle plastics once before they become fairly unrecyclable, just because of their molecular structure. And in addition to that, recycling uses huge amounts of energy and human labor, and is often shipped to places where those plastics did not originate from or were not being used. So there's all kinds of questions of environmental justice that are bound up in the question of its recomposition. So thinking about these two substances, sand, rock, and plastics as multiple substances that are one another, for me is an important reminder both of the kind of physical difficulties of what we do with this material, but also of a philosophical problem that asks us to really think through where these materials come from and how they're being used, and the fact that we cannot separate them out. I think that a lot of the ways in which plastic has circulated in the environment is because we believe that somehow it can be separated out and that it won't get into everything. But of course, as we've seen, it does get into everything. It's been found in our cells, it's been found in placentas, it's in our drinking water, it's in our salt, it's everywhere. So plastiglomerate, in a sense, then represents a new kind of hybrid materiality, not two distinct classifications of substances. Instead, it is the evidence of the plasticity of plastic's ability to morph into virtually all shapes, to penetrate all environments, to reconfigure what is often understood as solid, even the literal rock under our feet. It embodies the paradoxical relation of plastic itself, a substance designed for its universality, non-locality, and division from earthly troubles, that ultimately enfolds back into the earth and becomes its surrounds. In this, the plastiglomerate relates a deep and profound lesson about the fact of earthly being. Try as we might to separate out matter from mind or synthetic from natural objects, there is an ultimate enfolding, enmeshment, imbrication, inter and intra-action of matter in the world. So this is the first example of a kind of artistic taking up of the question of these plastic agglomerates. And maybe just also to make clear, the plastic agglomerates on your screen haven't been modified in any way or shape by the artist. She just picked them up and then just photographed them on this white background. And we can think about them as a kind of landscape art that we're all contributing to, maybe more or less depending on our particular social locations. But something that is being produced through kind of global circulation of this material. Now, the other example that I thought I would talk about today in relationship to questions of vulnerable landscapes and how we might rethink questions of landscapes is through this project by artist Mary Mattingly around questions of cobalt and cobalt circulation. And so Mary Mattingly is an artist also based in New York City, and she's been working with questions of commodity flows for a very long time in her practice. And one of the things that she began to realize is that she was originally trained as a photographer, and in her photography practice, she realized that cobalt is one of the fundamental elements in all of her cameras. So from her very old Hasselblad cameras to digital cameras, cobalt is an essential element in all of this. And so she became very interested in cobalt and its global circulation as a way of thinking through maybe vulnerable landscapes that we are tied to, but maybe not in the kind of direct ways in which the other speakers are thinking of. So cobalt is often mined from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Australia, Canada, or elsewhere. And it's frequently also embedded in drones, where they're then used not only for military, corporate, and leisure activities, but also by mining and oil companies looking for new areas to plunder. So drone and satellite technology are increasingly used by extraction companies to reduce exploration costs. So as Macarena Gomez-Beres writes, who's a visual culture person, she describes how modern states coordinate with multinational corporations using reconnaissance systems to collect large data sets and produce high resolution maps that are deployed to build extractive industries on the ground. In particular, the Five Eyes states, which are the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, have increasingly invested in satellite technologies that support the planet's mapping for military and surveillance purposes, as well as for the conversion of natural resources into commodities. So one of the things that's happening here is that cobalt produces the means to extract more cobalt, right? And all of the other minerals that go into our visual technological systems. And so being somebody who is deeply embedded in thinking through questions of visual relationships and photography in particular, Mattingly wanted to really explore these relationships of cobalt because of the ways in which it's deeply caught up in these practices of extractivism and mining worldwide. And how do we think about our relationships to these incredibly long commodity chains that sometimes are taking place at a real distance from our everyday lives? So for Mattingly, cobalt becomes a way to speak simultaneously to the issues of the implication of extractivism in visual technologies, as well as working through our personal investments, our tied intimacies to these chains of violent exploitation. So Mattingly's engagement with cobalt has been expansive. For example, she's produced these ever-shifting maps of commodity chains, which is what you're looking at here on this screen. And you'll notice that if it looks like a chalkboard, it's because it is a chalkboard. And the reason why she she represents it in this way is because, as with all commodities, the prices of commodities go up and down. And because the prices of the commodities go up and down, then the circulation patterns of cobalt across the globe change. So it might then become more or less expensive to extract cobalt in a particular place. So then more production is happening in one particular place, and then it's moving differently throughout the world. So this is one way in which she's grappling with these questions of cobalt. The other ways in which she's grappling with these questions of cobalt is to produce these sculptures that are a kind of other type of sort of affective or resonance or emotional working through of how we think about cobalt in the world, and how we think about our relationship to commodities. So, so she again also uses in her practice a lot of found objects or objects from her own home. And here she's working with cobalt as in the color that we associated with it. And tying these objects together into these kinds of bundles, which has long been part of her practice. And I really am drawn to these objects, even if they're maybe a bit abstract in their relationships, because I think it really speaks to the ways in which we are bound to the objects that we have in our lives, but also they have this kind of weight to them. And in particular, through this relationship to these cobalt objects, I really feel like these speak to me because they feel like an effective and material working through of the complicated and violent entanglements that we are caught in. So the strings that serve to bind objects together here becomes a way to think through what Donna Haraway calls string figures. So these are like literal strings that are binding us to these objects, both in beautiful ways, but also in these incredibly violent ways. As probably many of you know, a lot of the mechanisms for extracting cobalt from the earth are incredibly violent and lead to the deaths of many people. So the material entangled objects mirror how many of us feel caught in systems not of our own making, but from which we nonetheless benefit. They offer a kind of visual representation of our own willing and advantageous bondage. But instead of hand-wringing or denunciation, the work offers a way to think through these bloodied objects as parcels or as opportunities for care. They offer a kind of ethical frame where outrage isn't quite possible because we are simply too close. They make us feel implicated while sidestepping guilt. There is something in the production of these tableaus that offers an effective alternative, maybe somewhat along the lines of what Rahul was talking about in terms of thinking through grief. So not to let us off the hook or to dissuade from political lobbying or activism in more concrete ways, but to show us the ways in which we are bound to things that we abjure, things that we would rather not be associated with. So whether we like it or not, we are composed of and dependent upon these complicated and violent global entanglements. There is, importantly, no innocence in these staged scenes. There is also no sense of removal. So instead, there is a working through of objects and legacies, a working with that expresses care for the objects themselves and the implication in their violence. The attention and centering of the objects allows them to be both otherwise, to redraw the relations of the commodity change of cobalt and its gross injustices, while also grouping them together precisely through this frame. So I think what these two examples of these very different types of taking up of a kind of landscape, and I realize I haven't actually shown you any landscapes, but I hope that in some ways you have these objects are maybe asking us to think about what a vulnerable landscape could be outside of the kind of pictorial traditions that we're familiar with or outside of our own relationships to the lands that we occupy. But I think what they offer is a way to think through contemporary extractivist politics in manners that implicate, embody, and intimately encounter the materials of exploitation. So instead of moving away from these problems, or the kind of what visual culture theorist Nick Mirzoff calls an anesthetics, that is anesthetizing us to the kinds of violence that we see around us all of the time, I find that these objects help us produce works that are engaging, that actually kind of invite us in, that allow us to sit with the complications of these violence, of this pervasive violence in a different way. So by refusing both the strategies of distanced photography, as well as perhaps a too easy critical distance, they're effective and bodily working through provides a means to think about our entanglements with the violent rituals of industrialized capitalism. If extractivism and visuality are intimately linked, then both these artists are working through various strategies and means to reconnect the embodied practices of looking that deeply acknowledge our implications in the horrors of our times. So politically, of course, this is not enough. This isn't like a program for thinking about what to do with the problems. I think that the Zara project is a beautiful example of things that we can do within the realm of art and aesthetics and community organizing that gives us a strategy for moving forward. But I do think that this is maybe one way to think through the kinds of practices of, or thinking through the kind of witnessing of grief, even if it's in a kind of abstract way that Rahul was speaking to at the beginning. It allows us, I believe, a means through which to re-examine our relations to the mineralogical through practices that bind us to the earth and to each other. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Hita. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, right. And somebody maybe in the auditorium there also can confirm. Maybe Rahul, if you can nod your head, if you can hear, then I can see your image, and or if you're not able to hear me, then Rahul, can you hear us? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask somebody who's following the other feed to also post in questions. I'm not seeing anything on the Zoom channel yet where we all the four of us are. So I mean, there's a possibility of me asking a few questions, and I realized as I was listening, the kind of questions that came to my mind were more on the kind of autobiographical or the biographical mode for all our three speakers. And maybe I can, since we've not yet heard from our audience, maybe I'll just pose maybe one and a half question each, and which of course links up to what you've presented and your work, but also kind of pushing you individually to look at some aspect of your own practice. And if I might just, I'll put the questions out to each of you, and then maybe you can respond. And if I was to start with you, Arun, first, you being from the Western Ghats and then going to a completely different landscape, culturally, physically, ecologically. And then your work that you presented is all about the vulnerable landscape of the Western Ghats. But you as an artist, a professional, how do you juxtapose, or how do you look at Gurgaon, where you are today, the kind of hub of modern India, with all its challenges? Where does that vulnerability, or do you look at Gurgaon as vulnerable? How do you look at that vulnerability? How do you juxtapose that as a vulnerable landscape, as you've looked at Western Ghats? So I'll park that question for you. I'll go to Rahul, and then Hida, and then we can come back. Rahul, for me, it was, like I said, a very evocative presentation. And the question for me, if I just saw a little bit of your biography, working in Jharkhand, and your I think PhD work, if I'm not mistaken, is on Birsa Munda. What was your journey that took you to explore grief? What has led you to ask those questions and explore that space? And I had another very, must be methodologically, in terms of this question of capturing and visualizing grief in conversations. How do you do that? I mean, you also mentioned that you mentioned a very interesting thing that said grief is a feeling. And I was just comparing this to the question of oral tradition. How do you capture orality, and then what happens when you transfer it into text? So I'm sure you've had these challenges. So if you could reflect that a little bit on how you came to grief, to work on grief, and what does it mean to deal with grief and to ask those questions and to vocalize or visualize or make them visual. So that would be for Rahul. And Hita, I was, what really struck me, and I'd like you to reflect on that. We were speaking about vulnerable landscapes, but what emerged from me from listening to you was the landscape of vulnerability. It's not just about vulnerable landscapes. So it's like there's a huge landscape that we have created of vulnerability, and that reflects in physical landscapes, but like you pointed out, in much more. So if you could, if that resonates with you, perhaps. And the question for you, like for Rahul, is how did you come to plastic? In the sense that I think a lot of your work, at least what one sees briefly, is a lot on plastic. So there must have been some backstory there that perhaps brings you to that. So I will ask I will request you in the order that I asked. So Arun, for you to reflect a little bit on the Gurgaon, Western Ghats. Is Gurgaon also vulnerable? Are we going to have a Sara Center in Gurgaon for the people and the landscapes of Gurgaon? You don't have to, but how do you look at that? Yes, please.
Thank you for this very difficult question. I've been in Gurgaon since last 20 years, and I have seen how the city grown beyond anybody's control. At some point, I used to see part of Gurgaon from my window as, there was nothing. And then I saw everything, how it was growing in the last 20 years. And maybe this, where I come from, and then being in a metro like this, fast growing metro like this, there is always a constant comparison between two landscapes. And now, I mean, Gurgaon is beyond anybody's control. I mean, any cities like that. And but anyway, I'm slowly this uncontrollable thing is also is withdrawing myself from a city and then moving back to and also because a place where I come from, it is my primary responsibility to address that very immediate backyard of mine, where I was born and brought up, and my family stay there and everything. But hardly, that kind of activities are, one can imagine that was not really happening, though a lot of activists and theater activists and other friends, they were doing at their own capacities, but not in a coming together and doing something like this. But staying in city just happens, and we also have something here in Gurgaon associated with things like that. But it is beyond control, and also there are so many people working in cities already, but not really so many people working back at in a rural where the landscape is really vulnerable. Of course, cities like Gurgaon is also vulnerable because it doesn't have water. It has to bring water maybe 300-400 kilometers away from, so it is vulnerable, but it is such a great power that it can bring water from anywhere. But that's not, but in our place, in like my own well, if there is no water in that well, there's nobody to give water. So that is the danger. So that has happened, and many summers that we didn't have water in the well, I don't know how we managed. So that is the level of vulnerability to coming to the basics of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Arun. I think a constant dilemma that we face in different ways of the choices that we have to make. Thank you so much. Rahul, would you like to respond? Think about what I was trying to ask you.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So the first part of your question, which is what was my work? So I did my PhD, my MPhil, and then followed by an MPhil, I did a PhD on what is going to be a book soon on politics of memory among Adivasi. And I looked at how memory and history function as a two-end of political imagination among Adivasi. Yeah, no, so I did a lot of work on and around memory and history, which is my manuscript. And in that process, I realized that a lot of how we are trained to work with ideas on ground don't hold so much of meaning in the way people's lives are lived and the texture that they offer you during that period. Even though we consolidate that into a form of a data to present an analysis, there always remains a possibility to read each in details. So now I'm a postdoc and I'm part of a project that looks at rights of rivers. I'm interested in how, the reporting in general, but also the discussion around climate change in India in particular is just modeled around these ideas of resilience that assumes every human of having the equal power to recover from loss that is incurred. And not just that, my experience in working with Adivasi, learning from, getting educated by them while working on the ground about how memory lingers, structured some of my ideas about, or informed some of my ideas about grief. And I don't think that grief still, because we continue to treat, I think, emotion as an appendix, we still think it does not hold in itself an argument of its own. It can only function as, in addition to an information that's scientifically approved. So that's larger frustration I have with the climate change discourse. So I think a lot of what I do now with climate change is actually drawn from what I did during my PhD, which is to trace a storied life of people, the way they make sense of the world, not just in relation to each other, but in relation to the environment in which they live, which very much structure their life. So yeah, I want to mainstream basically how we can use grief as a political imagination, which is not just, we think of grief as a form of emotion, it is, but it is also more than emotion, because it's not just a response, but it is also a sustained form of engagement with loss. And for instance, in the interview that I had with the person, and I was born and brought up in Bihar, and this person who lost his brother is now survived with 5 family members. And the whole of their life is now structured by the grief that lingers. It's no more, of course, the question of compensation is important, but it's only in so far their material life can be taken care of. Beyond that, I don't think we have a language around addressing affective, things that impact our life. Yeah, I don't know if I answered, but I'm also writing my preface, so it's a good, good way to get to that. Thank you for the question, Pankaj.
I do have a follow-up, but I'll come back, a follow-up to this answer, but also the second question on the method in some senses. But maybe we'll go to Heather and then come back, and hopefully there'll be other questions as well. So thanks a lot, Rahul, for that. Yeah, Heather, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for those questions. Yeah, so maybe I'll start sort of in reverse order. So how did I come to working or thinking with plastic? Maybe like the other people, it was from a kind of personal investment. So my maternal grandfather was originally an engineer, and then later a manager at DuPont for his entire life, and was involved with making the milk bag, which I know you all use in India, as well as all kinds of synthetic textiles. And so, you know, having this kind of legacy that then in some ways really structured my life, you know, my educational opportunities in many ways came from this kind of a legacy, right? My kind of like many of the privileges and comforts of my life are deeply embedded and connected to both this personal relationship to plastic and the kinds of ramifications of what that comes out. But also I was thinking about it in terms of a kind of broader inheritance. So the ways in which, and in the larger, in the book project, I sort of divided into thinking through questions of plastics inheritance and plastics transmission. So for those of us, and I realize there's many people who sort of fall in between those two categories, but for those of us who really benefit from the relations to plastic, that we can think about this as a kind of inheritance, right? But then what does that inheritance do, especially if we don't want it, right? Like, especially if we're coming into this world and we would rather it not be the way that it is. How do we think about the ways in which we are thoroughly constituted by this material, or thoroughly constituted by our relationships to fossil fuels more broadly, but that at the same time, this is maybe not the world that we want, right? So how do we think through those kinds of legacies? Is there sort of the question that really animated my working around plastic? And then just to kind of clarify, transmission is more about the ways in which plastics has been imposed upon so many people without their kind of like real knowledge or consent, right? So, and of course, I think many of us actually really sort of fit in between those categories. It's not an easy division. I think in some moments we're the inheritors, and some moments we're the receivers of this. But to think about those things conceptually is just helpful to make a distinction. And then in terms of landscapes of vulnerability, I think that you're right. I think it was a very astute observation. Is both the ways in which clearly landscapes are vulnerable, right? We can see this all over the globe in so many different places. Just a few hours upstate from here, for example, in and around Bennington, there's entire water systems that are completely polluted because of the plastics industry. So this is an ongoing problem in many, many different places in the world. But I think that also vulnerability offers a potentially a kind of open, like an emotional or an affective openness that might allow us to see things differently. So if part of what the kind of logics of plastic is this kind of barricading, or this belief that somehow we can produce something that will stay outside of us, and that you know, especially in a kind of Euro-Western model, that we are individuals that are separate from the world, that a kind of logic or an invitation towards vulnerability allows us to see more clearly that is just fundamentally untrue, right? Like that all of these toxins are coming in and out of our bodies all of the time, you know, from the kinds of, you know, mercury that's associated with dams to the kinds of petrochemicals that are associated with plastics. But that really inviting or being curious about that kind of vulnerability might invite a different kind of logic in terms of how do we actually engage with the world around us, and might offer a kind of openness that I think is part of what is required in terms of the kind of affective shift or philosophical shift that is necessary in addition to all these kinds of more practical or activist-based solutions or scientific practices that Rahul was talking about and Arun was talking about.
Right, thank you. I was just wondering, we have one question from the audience, and that's for Arun. I'll come to you, Arun, with that question. But would any of the panelists want to ask anything to each other? Because I mean, many things link up what you all said and what you've heard. So maybe Hita, if you have a question either for Rahul or for Arun, and then maybe we can take a round of questions and then you can go in circles.
Yeah, maybe I can ask two questions. I can think one to like together, but Arun, I was really curious, like how has working with Sarah changed your personal practice as an artist? Like how does it kind of feed back in to the work that you do? Like you showed us these beautiful panels, and I'm wondering if that is a kind of direct result, or like how else are you thinking about your own personal practice from starting that project?
You have a question.
And then, should I ask the question to Rahul right now?
Yeah. Maybe I'd suggest you do that, and then we can go to Rahul and Arun and then come back. Yeah, please.
Okay. And then Rahul, I mean, I'm super compelled by your analysis of grief and the ways in which it's kind of like, there's a kind of stuckness to grief. And it reminds me too of Katrina Mortimer Sandilands writes really beautiful about melancholy in relationship to environmental destruction. And she relates this to thinking about movements like ACT UP, which was like a very famous group in the 1980s and 90s of activists who were working around HIV/AIDS and the devastation to especially gay communities around HIV/AIDS, but how the kind of public performance of grief in their activist projects, for example, taking the ashes of their loved ones and dumping it in the Capitol, how refusing to move on was this real kind of like activist stance. And there's something about the ways in which you're talking about the kind of refusal to move on in grief that reminds me of a kind of similar kind of like refusal of like progressive modernity, refusal of the kind of narratives that a lot of us are caught up in. I don't know if that resonates for you, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Great, thank you. I would like to take your question and then we go to Rahul.
Yeah, thank you, Hidar, for that wonderful question. In my earlier practice, I used to mostly spend in in studios and really gather for information was like almost second-hand information. So here, being on the ground is mostly, you gather your first-hand information. And then there is so much so much to learn and do in a place where what I'm doing at the moment. But somehow I have ceased to learn much from in a city where where I spend some of my time here. Definitely, it is changing my practice. Something like that is much larger. Like it's like a social practice or something like that. So there is a possibility to learn every day. There are new challenges every day, and working with the community, there are challenges every day. But of course, we have a different challenges in studio practice. But working on the site, real site, working with people, community, in a time like this, it is much more challenging for an artist.
Thanks, Arun. And before I go to Rahul, there is a question for you in the chat box, Arun, which is the question, I don't know whom it is from, but is Sara open as a residency space for exploration and collaboration? Yes, if you can answer that as well, please.
Yes, Sara is open, and it is still in the making. Maybe in a few days, it is going to take that shape. Because my travel has been restricted since last 1 to 2 years because of this pandemic. I was supposed to be there, but I couldn't go, and so that is the reason all these things are getting delayed. But these things are there because the whole idea is to have people there, different practitioners, researchers, artists, and have a dialogue. That is the basic idea of Sara.
All right, great, thank you. Rahul?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Hidar, for the reference to melancholy. Can you hear me? Okay. No, I agree with what you said. And definitely, I mean, recently a poet called Chang, she published an anthology of poem called Orbit, which is an anthology of poems on grief, where she has a sentence that helped me tell what I also want to say, where she says that grief is a liminal space between the dead and the living. It is by the diction as a word in itself is a refusal to leave. And I think in that sense, even within my own paper and larger work, within climate change and in general interest in life is to trace grief as a way of refusal to organize life on terms of explanation. Right, so I think one of the attempts I'm making in this paper, which is largely conceptual, is to move away from causal effect explanations of climate change. That is not to say that scientific reports are not important, but it is to say that it's not the only explanation of the event, right? And that helps me also come back to Pankaj. In terms of method, I think I sort of use description as a way of analysis instead of using description just merely as a form of writing. So for me, the content that emerged from an interaction, but also how it's located in a certain environment, constitute the core of my argument. So description is not passive just as a way to explain something, but it's a content in itself. And recently, I think just to make it more grounded in the works that's been done, Nainika Mathur has published a fantastic book called Crooked Cats, and where she talks about hostility between forest conservation and wildlife, and she talks about how do we write in an era of an Anthropocene, where we are at the center of changing the entire ecology, and she says that we write what we find, and as long as we can write is the only way to talk about a crisis. And I find it very easy because I've been trained in political science and anthropology, and none of these disciplines seems to have helped me write what I do now, except the fact that I just use everything that comes my way, and I think that's the only way to write in the mid of a crisis that's unfolding right now and has been unfolding for a while, to write and try to tell a story in everything that we encounter. Yeah.
Thank you, Rahul. We're kind of touching 9 p.m. here in India, and maybe we can take the last 7-8 minutes to wrap up. I hope the organizers are okay with that, but maybe I can just exercise my prerogative as a chair here and just say that that's how it's going to happen. And in connection and in continuation, Rahul, you have any quick questions either for Arun and or Hita?
Not really.
I was hoping you'd make my job easier. Arun, would you like to, or maybe reflect on something, maybe not just ask. Rahul, you've already said some things about what you've heard, but it need not be a question. You could also reflect. And if not, then I'd ask Arun to also maybe.
Yeah. Hither, it is for you actually. I was so glad to hear your reference to Mary Mattingly's works, and I had been following her work, and I had met her also in a residency. Her practice is very interesting. I was very happy to know this new work that is following or tracing cobalt and things like that. So, and your, the work that you are doing on the plastic is again very enriching insight for me. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's yeah. Hida, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you. It's really been so enriching to hear about your practice, Arun, and as well as your work, Rahul.
if I might, jump in here and ask Arun again. I was again making a note, Arun. There's a dimension of yours of an artist. Then at some moment, even in your presentation, you kind of start to, and maybe that is not pejorative, but an activist. And then you also come across as a facilitator. You're creating platforms for people to come together. So is this for you? Are these contiguous? Do they clash with each other, or you see your work as having moved from being an artist? And I think you partly answered that earlier. But do these three kind of categories, are they categories for you, or it just is something that I have just constructed while listening to you?
No, whatever is happening, whatever you saw, it is all, in continuation with, my earlier practice. So initially, in 2006 and 10, I was basically addressing issues on, agrarian challenges, and then slowly it was touching to environmental or ecological challenges. And when I went deeper and deeper, then I have my own backyard, my own family, and so we are also as a farmers facing so much of challenges, and then it goes beyond my family, and it goes to villages and region and things. So I mean, that becomes a necessity for me to have a kind of space that can bring people together, and otherwise it is not that easy, and people don't take you seriously, and then you don't see results in a tangible way, in the sense people coming and having sharing their ideas and things like that. Otherwise things are it can fizzle out anytime. So having a kind of a base like this can like what I am planning is to have a content for school children and teachers and farmers for every day coming there and experiencing and leaving their ideas, things like that. I don't have to be there all the time. And then at the same time it is for why everything should be in in urban centers. Everything is because like cities, our life is so exhausted with imageries, but there I can see that they are still hunger for imageries and visuals and information and all that, because they are on the real side and facing everyday challenges. So but I mean, these are all my experiment with, I mean, not just my experiment. It's we are friends working together, organizations working together, and coming up with strategies where we also learn so much. Yeah, I mean, it has become a necessity for me.
Thank you. I was really struck by the repeated use of the term experiment. You also mentioned it in your presentation, and I think that's a very productive kind of category in terms of action. But yeah, so thank you so much, Arun, Rahul, Hita, our curators, Ravi, Ranjit, the organizers, for putting this together, for inviting us, for giving us the opportunity. For me, it's been hugely educative and evocative. And thank you so much. I was just hoping there'd be a little more participation this time from our audience, but well, what can we do? Yeah. Thank you so much to everybody, and hand it over back to the organizers. Ravi, I can see Ravi on the screen there. Yes, Ravi.
Arun, Rahul, Heather, Pankaj, thank you very much for a fantastic panel and for keeping it so alive, with a fantastic exchange and I think so many more things to reflect on. It's 9 o'clock here now, so we're going to meet tomorrow at 4 o'clock IST, Indian Standard Time. And those of you who are on the panel who have the time and could join tomorrow, it would be fantastic. We have, I think you all have the program, and otherwise I can WhatsApp it to all of you again. So thank you for joining from New York, Heather. I know it's really early in the morning. And Arun, I can see you're dressed in Delhi winter. Okay. Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you.